Dear Professor Klose, dear discussants and esteemed guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this pre-panel to next year's Herrenhausen Conference Governing Humanitarianism. Humanitarianism and human rights are, of course, of unbroken relevance in our social life and in our public discourse. Some of the dramatic events this year have pointedly illustrated their significance, but also their fluid design. Let's look at Germany. After the catastrophic flooding in Western Germany, humanitarian interventions were quick and they remained unquestioned. If we look at Haiti, international interventions for Haiti, which was hit by a devastating earthquake with thousands of victims, only weeks after the events in Germany, they were less intense. Still ongoing are the concerns for the deteriorating human rights in Afghanistan. Yet, the question of granting asylum to refugees from the country is not answered uniformly. Rejecting the notion altogether, for example, Austria's Minister of the Interior, Nehammer, went as far as to say that if there are limitations to repatriations because of the European Human Rights Convention, then the EU should come up with alternatives. Thus, both humanitarianism and human rights are in practice very much a matter of interpretation. Politics and society may act upon and enforce them, but they can also ignore or undermine them. Today's discussion will contextualize and historicize humanitarianism and human rights. The discussion can highlight the interconnectedness of the two concepts. It is my hope, ladies and gentlemen, that today's debate will cross professional, disciplinary, and geographical borders. Conjoining contrasting perspectives can be a stepping stone towards a consolidated framework. And this framework, in turn, can support action that is more dependable. I wish us all a fruitful discussion, and I invite everybody to register for next year's conference governing humanitarianism online at www.volkswagenstiftung.de. And now I leave the floor to Professor Johannes Paulmann from the Leibniz Institute for European History in Mainz for a short introduction by the organizers.
Welcome all to the digital panel on the complicated relationship between humanitarianism and human rights. Today's event is part of a larger international conference on governing humanitarianism, past, present, and future, that was originally planned for September 2020. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we had to postpone it twice. The main conference will now take place in Hanover in September 2022. Speaking for the organizers, Stacey Hein from Exeter, Fabian Klose from Cologne, Andrew Thompson from Oxford, and myself from Mainz, I wish to thank the Volkswagen Foundation very much for its sustained support. We've been very fortunate that the Foundation has made every effort over the last 2 years to keep this initiative going. I also warmly thank the colleagues on today's panel and tomorrow's keynote speaker that they welcomed the idea to prepare the actual conference by participating in these digital events. The conference emerged from the Global Humanitarianism Research Academy. This was a 5-year program for international PhD students that combined academic training, archival research, and discussions with humanitarian organizations active in the field. The Global Humanitarian Research Academy was a collaboration between the Leibniz Institute of European History in Germany, the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland. In our discussions between academic researchers and with humanitarian actors, we focused on how legacies of and lessons from past events could inform present and future challenges to international action. Next year's Herrenhausen Conference Governing Humanitarianism emerges from those debates. There, we will discuss what effective ways of working, attuned to the realities now faced by global organizations, donors, and recipient communities actually look like. How can we rethink the future direction of humanitarian governance in the world, particularly given the impact of the corona pandemic and climate emergency? The Herrenhausen Conference seeks to bridge the various gaps between disciplines, scholarship, and practice across local, international, and global spheres. We hope that many of you in the audience today will join us in Hanover for the conference. Today's panel focuses on a core relationship in the debate on the past, present, and future of global humanitarian governance, a complicated relationship between humanitarianism and human rights. We're all very much looking forward to the discussion, and it gives me pleasure to hand over to my colleague from Cologne, Fabian Klose, who will chair this panel.
Good afternoon from Cologne, and a warm welcome to our digital panel, Human Rights and Humanitarianism, a complicated relationship ? First of all, allow me to thank Dr. Schütte for his kind introduction and the tremendous support by the Volkswagen Stiftung for our project all the way along. After two welcome addresses, I would like to come straight to our today's panel and our panelists, who are coming from different disciplines, namely international law, international history, and political science. It's my great pleasure to introduce very briefly our three panelists, starting with Professor Dr. Angelika Nußberger. Angelika Nußberger is Professor of International Law, Director of the Institute of Eastern European Law here at the University of Cologne, and former Vice President at the European Court of Human Rights in Straßbourg. She has intensively worked on human rights issues and widely published, just to mention her monograph, The European Court of Human Rights, last year. And she has just published a small but very readable book on the history and philosophy of human rights in German. She's also the founder of a new Academy of European Human Rights Protection here at the University of Cologne, which will be open next year. Julie Irwin is Professor of International History at the University of South Florida, Tampa. Her research focuses on the place of humanitarianism and foreign assistance in 20th century US foreign relations and international history. Her first book, entitled Making the World Safe, The American Red Cross and a Nation's Humanitarian Awakening, focuses on US relief efforts for foreign civilians in the area of the First World War. She has just published the manuscript of a second monograph entitled Catastrophic Diplomacy, A History of US Responses to Global Natural Disaster. And finally, Professor Dr. Michael Barnett. Michael Barnett is Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the George Washington University, Washington, D.C. He has widely published on the issues of humanitarianism, global governance, global ethics, and the United Nations. His book, Empire of Humanity, A History of Humanitarianism, is seminal, and you're probably familiar with it. He has recently published an intriguing new edited volume entitled Humanitarianism and Human Rights, A World of Differences, ? In which he focuses exactly on the blurred boundaries of both fields from an interdisciplinary point of view. So a warm welcome to you, and it's a great pleasure to have you all on this panel. Regarding the procedure of our 90 minutes panel, we will start with a 20 minutes keynote by Michael, which will be followed by two brief comments by Julia and Angelika. We will then start our discussion, and we would also like to include questions from the audience. And you can send your question to us via the chat function, which you can find below the live stream screen. We will collect them and then bring them in the discussion. But now I'm happy to hand over to Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward not only to the conversation this morning, but hopefully as we all get together next year and have an opportunity to not just simply have a bigger venue for these conversations, but to see each other in person. Let me start by sharing the screen. And Fabian, where are we? You can see it?
Yeah, it's fine. Fine.
Good.
Right.
Okay, great. So maybe the best way to begin is say why we endeavor to explore this issue and in many ways the origins of the edited volume. I think there were a lot of us, and I get that were in some ways mystified by this relationship between human rights and humanitarianism, and weren't really sure where the boundaries are, where they might be going. And part of it had to do, I would say, speaking personally, as I started working on humanitarianism back in the early part of this century. And I was deeply involved in trying to think about the history of humanitarianism. And my colleagues in human rights would ask me what I was working on. And I'd say, I'm working on humanitarianism. And they would look at me and say, well, isn't that the same thing as human rights? And I would say, no. And then I would begin to try to explain what those differences were. All very aware, quite honestly, that I wasn't satisfied with my answer, but more importantly, it seemed to satisfy them that, yes, in fact, they were doing human rights and I was doing humanitarianism, and we were in these separate fields. But meanwhile, I was also deeply aware that in the 1990s and continuing into this century, there was a very heated debate within the humanitarian sector over what role should there be for human rights. And many in the humanitarian sector tended to treat human rights as something of a moral pollutant, that if you actually allow human rights in, you're going to change the character of humanitarianism and not necessarily in a good way. There were others, though, within the humanitarian sector who said, no, there are areas of convergence, and we need to find those areas because together we're stronger. And this was the kind of debate that I saw in the 1990s, and again, continuing into this century. But I was, in some ways, still mystified by how it is that they found these boundaries and how it is they negotiated the relationship between humanitarianism and human rights. And as it turns out, as I would talk to my colleagues about my own queries about what that relationship is, I found that they were also somewhat mystified. And in many ways, though, the mystification had a different register depending on whether you're coming from the human rights or humanitarian sector. For those in the humanitarian sector, there was a kind of palpable anxiety, again, that the more human rights came into humanitarianism, perhaps the worse off humanitarianism would be. On the other hand, there were those who were coming from the human rights sector who were increasingly arguing that rights are ubiquitous, that they're everywhere, that they should be everywhere, including in areas of armed conflict, where in the past, humanitarianism had said, we've got a monopoly. So the ICRC, for instance, would say during armed conflict, their rules, humanitarian rules, trounce human rights rules. And one of the interesting things, though, is that this became up for debate. And so I wanted to bring together a core group of people from different disciplines, different sort of objects of history, to really think about and explore not just what those differences are, but as important, what difference does it make? What's really at stake when we're talking about these differences between humanitarianism and human rights? So this should be more than just simply another academic exercise of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but really, how does this matter for the world of practice? How does this matter for the world of ethics? What's really at stake when we talk about this relationship? And so that's very much, it wasn't simply the goal of the volume, but I think, it was very much the goal of everybody who had been wondering about what this relationship was between the two. Well, one of the things that we concluded right away, no differences here, is that we argued, and I'll come back to this, that these are what we would simply call social constructions. And by that, it means that humanitarianism and human rights do not have a fixed meaning, that rather their meanings change over time. They change in relationship to historical processes. They change in relationship to what great power actors want. They change also in relationship to the dynamics that were going on between humanitarianism and human rights. And so it really wasn't, you couldn't necessarily say, go to Oxford Dictionary, here's what humanitarianism is, and then here's what human rights is, and let's look at the difference. Rather, they were in constant negotiation with one another. That said, it was important for us to be able to say, let's start the conversation by imagining, let's see if I can, by imagining how these things might change. And so some of the preamble then was taking into account what I heard from, let's say, many people within the human rights sector, which is that humanitarianism and human rights begin with the discourse of humanity. That discourse began sometime in the 18th century. And so there would be famous scholars like Lynn Hunt, who would trace human rights back to the 18th century. And then there are other scholars who would trace humanitarianism back to the 18th century because both attached it to this language of humanity. But in many ways, although they both used humanity, they actually embedded or anchored themselves to different kinds of global projects. And, I would say at least my historical interpretation, but I'm always ready to defer to the real historians in the room, is that humanitarianism began very much in the late 18th, early 19th century with the campaign to end slavery. This is where you first really begin to hear the language of humanitarian as applied to the idea of reducing the unnecessary suffering of distant strangers. On the other hand, human rights was not a language that occurred in the slave trade, the campaign to end the slave trade. Rather, what human rights was about trying to establish, if you will, a safe contract or relationship between citizens and the state, so that you could preserve individual liberties. The state had enough resources to actually help maintain those liberties, but there were safeguards that were in place to help make sure that individuals were protected also from the state. And so largely human rights was about this relationship that went on domestically within the state. And a lot of conversations about humanitarianism were almost always about international activities. So they began to emerge in relationship to one another. And what was interesting, at least I would say in some of the many of the chapters in the book, was really trying to demonstrate how those relationships changed. And so there were various contributions in the book that took snapshots of a particular historical moment. There's a very nice chapter by Alan Lester, who's a professor of geography and colonial history, who looked at civilizing missions and British colonialism. And he noticed that when talking about protection of, let's say, Aboriginal populations in the colonial territories, there was often a language of humanitarianism. And he said that that wasn't just simply accidental. For many of the British elites, this was strategic, because humanitarianism is a conservative language. It is about preserving the order. It is about saying we're going to protect human life. That's our goal, full stop. As opposed to those who were engaged in rights debates or in human rights movements at home in Britain, for them it's about radical change. And so humanitarianism was a language conserving the political order, whereas human rights was about changing the order itself. And so as a consequence, that, which language emerged in the colonial territories was very much related to what were the political objectives of the British Home Office. There's another wonderful piece by Professor Aisling Swain at the University of College Dublin, who looks at, and based on her own experiences having worked in Darfur, began to sort of tease apart this relationship between human rights and humanitarian workers in Darfur itself, and particularly the initial, if you will, hesitation by many in the humanitarian sector to do anything with the language of rights. And so, as she says, early on in this dialogue, especially in the 1990s, humanitarian actors were not ready to take on human rights, and particularly were reluctant to take on questions of rights of women as a consequence of sexual violence. And she tracks how it is that humanitarian actors began to warm up to this language of rights in a very important way. But again, sort of trying to trace, what were those initial disagreements and how did they, if you will, how did they converge? So one of the, something just to repeat then, something that was really quite interesting between the pre and post Cold War period is that I think it'd be fair to say that before the end of the Cold War, human rights were here and humanitarianism was there, and there was very little dialogue between them. It was, for those who have children and have seen their children in a playground where they have their backs together and don't even recognize each other as they engage in what's called parallel play. That's kind of what was going on between human rights and humanitarianism, with some important exceptions. But with the end of the Cold War, the expansion of human rights, the growth of humanitarian emergencies and armed conflict, and human rights wanting to play a role here, you began to see more contestation, some convergence, and some divergence. And that, I think, that debate has settled down a bit, but it still goes on. And I'll come back to that in a minute. How am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay. This is actually a screen that I don't think anybody in our group would ever accept. And the reason why is because I've done exactly what I said before we should never do. Remember what I said, that these are social constructs and that they're, the relationship between them is ever changing and constantly in debate. And here what I've done, and this is just for the help of argument and provocation, is to say, here are, if you will, two stylized ideas of humanitarianism and human rights. Human rights has these characteristics and humanitarianism has these characteristics. And I think this is actually a reasonable first cut. And the reason why I go to this is because I think it helps us better understand at least some of the differences between them and some of the reasons why there's such, sometimes such contestation and misunderstandings. So let me just sort of run through the slide with a little, commentary as I go along. And the first, on the left side, we have purpose. And I think it's fair to say that most in the humanitarian field believe that their primary goal, their core reason for being is to save lives in need, to alleviate unnecessary suffering, particularly for those who face immediate physical peril. It's about keeping people alive. Human rights, though, operates with a different vernacular, and which is to advance flourishing, to allow people to live a rich and full life as they define it. And one of the languages that comes up then is, this difference that often persists between the two is that humanitarianism, is charity-based. It is about giving to people based on kindness, what we feel for others. But human rights uses the language of justice. And just to, I can, belabor this, but humanitarianism, by and large, gets rather uneasy when you begin to talk about the language of justice. It's not something that they work with a degree of ease. And we can talk about that more. Principles, they look the same on the surface, but in fact, they have some degree of difference. And, this will become a little more evident later, but both subscribe to humanity. For humanitarianism, it's the holy trinity of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. That language also exists for human rights, but whereas in many ways these principles serve a particular function and are reference to the idea of saving lives, in many ways for human rights, it is in relationship to what can be seen as universal values, that we're impartial with respect to the fundamental human rights and the need to protect and defend them. This relates to what I think is a huge difference between humanitarianism and human rights, in that if you're in the humanitarian sector, and here I'm talking about the international humanitarian sector, and you want to save lives, there's really only one way you can do it. You have to get access to the populations. Now, of course, with remote technologies and the like, and drone technologies, this is being relaxed a bit. But by and large, the goal of humanitarianism is to save lives. You try to save lives by getting access, being proximate to the populations, and you often use then these principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence, which is, that humanitarian space to convince your opposition, those who might actually thwart you, that in fact, you're there just for humanity, you're there just to save lives. On the other hand, when we think about how human rights changes, especially globally, it's not access dependent. That, when human rights activists do their work, it's not that they avoid the field's very important, but they meet in Geneva, in Paris, in New York, in London. Proximity is not necessarily foundational for their ability to save lives. Lots of human rights law can be changed without ever going into the field and in many ways engaging those whose rights have been violated. That's not the case at all for humanitarianism. What this means is that they have a very different relationship to politics. Humanitarianism is you just say no. It's not to say that they know that at some abstract level they're doing politics. Of course they are. But in many ways, it's very much that we're not disruptors. We're not here to change anything. We're not here to upset the political balance of power. We don't have a partisan agenda. We don't want to necessarily upset, local structures. And human rights, that's the point. It is a change. It's a change doctrine. It is to have a vision of what you think would be a more equitable human rights regime and build towards that. And this leads to a lot of really important differences then between how it is that humanitarians and human rights will engage individuals in authority. Education and training and tactics. This was one of the things that, really came out strongly in our conversations, is that, we began to look at, so where do you get trained? Because professional training actually isn't technical. It's also very value oriented. And a lot of the training in humanitarianism, if I were to say, if someone were to ask me, where do I go to get more training so I can become a humanitarian worker, I'd say public health, engineering, social work. These are the areas. I mean, these are the practical areas in which you go. And I hear my friends in human rights talk about what they advise their students. They'll say law. You go to law school, maybe journalism because you do advocacy, but your vocational training is quite different, and the tactics are different, which actually then reflects a lot about their orientation. That for humanitarianism, it's something called humanitarian diplomacy, which is complicated, but basically boils down to we don't make waves. We're quiet. It's quiet diplomacy. It's sort of the diplomacy with ICRC. You approach them on the side, you tell them, what you kind of need, and then hope that you can get leverage or access. The most famous tactic that emerged from human rights is, of course, name and shame, where you call people out, you call states out. And so humanitarians will derogatorily talk about human rights activists as moralizers. They're designed and the exact reverse of what humanitarians will do in terms of how to actually push their agenda. So the consequence then is that for humanitarians, very respectful of the state, very respectful of state sovereignty, human rights. They know that, in many ways you have to work with the state. But then again, there is this view, of course, that human rights trumps sovereign borders. That's not something that comes as easily to those in the humanitarian movement. The time horizon is also different. Humanitarianism works in the present. It doesn't actually look around the corner because its goal is to save lives. On the other hand, human rights works with a future horizon. There is something that you're trying to work for. And then finally, one of the most interesting differences that came up in our conversations, which is actually, I think, was a major reason why our conversations got so heated, was that those who were sort of coming from a humanitarian background really hated the language of progress. They could talk about getting better in their craft. They could talk about saving more lives with the same amount of resources, but the idea of progress, that you're working towards a better world, was something that made them deeply uncomfortable. And for human rights, though, a lot of, as this is what historians, there's a debate about whether human rights really is tied to a progressive narrative or not, but there's an agreement that there is some notion of progress and what you are moving towards. So those are some of the, what we found to be some of the interesting difference as a starting point, but in many ways it came down to these core issues of saving lives versus advancing flourishing. And I want to say it's not that human rights is not interested in saving lives. Of course it is, but that is also interested in all these other aspects of rights. So let me go to, this is the last slide, and these are more questions that we were not able to answer, but loom large. We figured that these were important questions. We didn't have enough time, we weren't smart enough or have enough time to really work them out. But these are the two that I guess I'd like to leave everybody with. The first is as I said at the beginning, important is that we think about what's at stake. And one of the important issues was that human rights and humanitarianism seem to have different ways of understanding our ethics, understanding the way we act in the world and our obligations and duties to others. Humanitarians, from the language of charity, often suggests that what we are doing is out of the kindness of our hearts. That the language of humanitarian rights, we see this occasionally, but the idea that humanitarians should fulfill, let's say, your fundamental right to these things is not something that humanitarians are comfortable with. And they would say, you might say that there's a right to food or a right to water, but it's not clear that it's the duty of humanitarians to provide that. Human rights, on the other hand, talks about our mutual obligations and duties to each other. It's a different ethical register. These things continue to have trade-offs. So let me just very quickly, pre-9/11, when the Taliban, their first tour of power, obviously there were a lot of humanitarian organizations that tried to work in Afghanistan. And one of the big issues at the time, and once again today, was what would be the relationship between rights and need. And humanitarians were insistent that we needed to provide all manner of need, that you didn't mess around with needs. If these were your needs, then you got them. If you had a need for shelter or medicine or water, clothing, these were your fundamental needs, and we would provide them. There were a lot of human rights organizations on the ground, though, who were appalled by what had happened to women and children, because under the Taliban, their rights had been just trampled on. And so one of the big debates that came up, and human rights organizations in many ways put this on the table, was to say maybe we should use food as a leverage for promoting women's rights. So if in fact we are not able to have women involved in even the distribution of humanitarian aid, or allow women to serve in aid organizations, or girls to go to school, maybe we should say then that you have forfeited your access to fundamental humanitarian aid. A lot of aid organizations just simply refused that you did not, in no uncertain terms, make aid conditional on rights. We're beginning to hear a little bit about that again. It's coming up as we see these contrasting concerns, because Afghanistan is collapsing, especially the health system. There's a food crisis, and yet at the same time, there is this rightly ongoing worry about the status of women and girls in Afghanistan, and what leverage do others have to try to protect them. So that's the first one. The second is this really interesting question about which is more likely to survive. Is it humanitarianism or human rights? And much of this is tied to this question about the liberal international order, and whether in fact you think human rights or humanitarianism are more dependent on the liberal international order. And this is where there have to be debates about what's the relationship between human rights history, humanitarian history, and imperialism, Western expansionism, the liberal international order. And the presumption is the more tied one is to these bigger, grand geopolitical structures, the more difficult your life will be going forward. And so, for instance, if we're moving in a geopolitical world from the West to Asia and China, what's going to fare better, human rights or humanitarianism? My sense is it'll probably be humanitarianism, in part because it's not as closely tied to notions of liberalism, and because most societies do have fundamentally an idea of humanitarianism very much within law, culture, and religion. So let me end there. And I look forward to listening to the rest of the comments.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this intriguing keynote. And I'm very curious about the perspectives and the comments which are coming now from a historian and then from an international lawyer. So I hand over to Julia for her brief comment. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks for organizing and for inviting us here today. It's really an honor and a privilege to comment on Professor Barnett's keynote. And we've known each other for quite a long time, and his work has been really influential to me as well, and to many of us in the field. We're here today, as the title of our panel suggests, to discuss humanitarianism, human rights, and their complicated relationship. I imagine that most of us who are gathered here in the audience as well have a sense that humanitarianism and human rights are related to one another in some way, and perhaps in multiple ways, as we've discussed today. They share common etymological roots tied to humanity and humanism. Both are concerned at a fundamental level with improving the human condition. And yet, even though we tend to view humanitarianism and human rights as related concepts, we don't usually consider them to be synonymous. As Professor Barnett explained in his remarks, we typically see them as somehow distinct from one another. We place them in discrete analytical categories, historically, legally, and politically. In his acclaimed book, Empire of Humanity, from about 10 years ago, published in 2011, Professor Barnett himself initially tried to capture these distinctions, and he offered a trio of competing meanings that have been described to those two terms. And here I'd like to quote: human rights relies on a discourse of rights, humanitarianism on a discourse of needs. Human rights focuses on legal discourses and frameworks, whereas humanitarianism shifts attention to moral codes and sentiments. Human rights typically focuses on the long-term goal of eliminating the causes of suffering, humanitarianism on the urgent goal of keeping people alive. I'm sure that many of us here today would recognize the basis for this distinction that Barnett once proposed, and which he has developed further in his remarks today. We might even find some utility in these analytical categories, employing them in our own research and scholarship, or in our various professional endeavors in the field. And yet, a central argument running through Professor Barnett's more recent published writings and his comments today, and an argument I'd really like to make now in my own response, is that perhaps we should not focus so intently on these differences. We would be better served instead to think more critically about all that humanitarianism and human rights have in common, and to interrogate the complicated relationship that they share. In the introduction to his newly published edited volume, which I have right here, and in his remarks today, Barnett makes the following observation: human rights and humanitarianism have no fixed meaning. They are social constructions, he continues. They are historically situated, and they have been distant and intimate from each other over the decades. Throughout his book, Barnett and his co-authors urge readers to consider the fluctuating relationship between human rights and humanitarianism, and to consider the many ways that these concepts have coexisted, crossed boundaries, and converged over the years. The volume's subtitle asked, "Is there a world of differences between humanitarianism and human rights?" Barnett's answer, I think, would be no, but I'd like to discuss this further as we continue. Barnett is not alone in making these arguments. In recent years, scholars across multiple disciplines have begun to concede that these differences are neither so vast nor so fixed as we once assumed. Rather than insisting on some sort of essential or universal definition of humanitarianism and human rights, academics from various disciplines have begun to explore what they call their entangled history, their convergence, and their troubled rapport. In various books and articles, historians and other scholars have recently examined such topics as humanitarian interventions, rights-based humanitarianism, and the humanitarianization of human rights. As this new wave of scholarship reveals, human rights and humanitarianism are both intimately related and routinely conflated. This is a principal point, I think, of some of Professor Barnett's recent writings, and I should add one of the guiding themes of this panel as a whole. Our aim today is not to highlight or to tease apart the distinctions between humanitarianism and human rights, or at least not the only aim. Instead, I think we all start from the assumption that these concepts are social, legal, and political constructs, and that the boundaries between them are fundamentally messy and blurred. Rather than striving to identify and delineate the essential differences between humanitarianism and human rights, our intent should be to discuss them alongside one another in a way that is more productive and generative. If we were to imagine these concepts as a pair of circles in a Venn diagram, our discussion would be focused on the center, at the point of intersection, a conceptual space that is much larger than we often assume. Building off Professor Barnett's remarks today and other writings, I'd like to propose three possible ways that we might interrogate the relationship between humanitarianism and human rights more effectively. I hope that these three frames can help to guide us. First, as we move into a conversation with one another, and then as we field questions from the audience. First, I think we really must consider these concepts with an eye toward chronology and periodization. Many scholars and practitioners have identified the 1990s as a pivotal turning point for reasons Professor Barnett mentioned. They highlight the international debates over humanitarian interventions in Rwanda, the Balkans, and elsewhere as the moment in which notions of humanitarianism and human rights first really converged. However, there are also other earlier turning points that we might fruitfully consider. For example, several historians in recent years have called attention to the conflation of human rights and humanitarian rhetoric during the 1970s and early 1980s, charting them in response to refugee crises that followed the Vietnam War and civil wars in Central America. Going back much further in time, other scholars, including my fellow panelist, Professor Klose, have identified the links between humanitarianism and human rights in the 19th century, amid debates over interventions in the Ottoman Empire and the international struggle over the Atlantic slave trade. We have much to learn from discussing these earlier moments when conceptual lines were also, to use Professor Barnett's words, contested, unsettled, and inflamed. Second, Barnett has encouraged us to understand humanitarianism and human rights as social constructs, which have no essential universal differences. As we do so, though, we should also consider the ways that different academic disciplines have constructed and used these terms. Political scientists, legal theorists, philosophers, anthropologists, and historians have all studied the concepts of humanitarianism and human rights extensively. But within each of our disciplines, the terms take on diverse meanings and have rather different connotations. In addition to recognizing how different disciplines define and employ these categories, we should also profitably consider the ways that interdisciplinary scholarship has helped to blur those distinctions over the years. Examining these more interdisciplinary investigations can enable us to think more critically about additional points of intersection and conceptual convergence. Third and finally, I think we must consider the matter of theory and praxis. Rather than treating this as a purely academic question, we must consider humanitarianism and human rights as they operate in the world. As Barnett reminds us in his recent book, these are not simply theoretical questions. Humanitarianism and human rights, as he stresses, are ethical projects that can have life and death consequences for vulnerable and marginalized populations. As scholars, we should therefore listen carefully to aid workers, human rights advocates, lawyers, and other practitioners in order to understand how they employ these terms in their own work. Just as critically, we must listen to the recipients of humanitarian aid and the targets of human rights advocacy. Rather than treating refugees, migrants, displaced persons, or persecuted populations as passive victims, we must acknowledge the agency of these populations and take seriously their understandings of human rights, humanitarianism, and humanity. As we think about the complicated relationship between humanitarianism and human rights, in short, we would do well to look beyond textbook definitions and academic publications. We must consider how the entwined history of these concepts shapes the rhetoric, methods, and practices of rights advocacy and humanitarian crisis management today. Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much. And actually, I would like to follow up one of your 3 points, the one you mentioned last time about the relation between theory and praxis. And I think the perfect way to hand over to Angelika Nußberger as someone who is an academic and worked on human rights in theory, but as a lawyer and vice president in Straßbourg, had to work as a practitioner, as a lawyer on these human rights issues. I'm very curious, Angelika, about your point of view on the relationship between humanitarianism and human rights. Angelika, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was also very happy about this transition made for me, and I thank you very much for these very, very interesting reflections you have shared with us. I'm really on the other continent in this discussion. I'm coming from another discipline, and I have a completely different outlook, and I hope it will be to a certain extent enriching for our discussion. I don't start with concepts, I really start with norms, and only then I look behind the norms and reflect on the background. And I start with efficiency, if something works, if something is a good tool, and then I think about the philosophy perhaps behind. And last but not least, I think in cases. So I always think in what is specific and what is general. And I also want to share with you cases to illustrate the relationship that you describe in theory. So as a lawyer and as a judge who has been sitting on cases concerning these issues, for me, the starting point is two legal regimes that have a certain relation. And the term of humanitarianism is not a term I would use. So for me, I use the term of humanitarian law, and that is a specific part of international law created in the end of the 19th century. And that is the time that you describe and where you see the roots of all that. You have mentioned the slave trade, and we focus in humanitarian law mostly on the help to survive for soldiers and the basic rules of conflict, not to kill prisoners of war and something like that. So this is for us the thrust of humanitarian law. To a certain extent, we can also add a refugee law to that, but it's a different branch of law. And on the other hand, we have human rights law that has developed more on the national level and on the international level after 45. So for me, as a starting point, it's two regimes of law. And if I now, as a practitioner of human rights law at probably the most effective or efficient human rights court, international human rights court, adjudicating about 60,000 cases a year. If you ask me how I look on humanitarian law, I would say it's older, it's more specific, and excuse me, but it's less effective in the sense that there is no court to enforce it. There's no direct complaint mechanism. And that's why our perspective at the Straßbourg court was always that we are doing something good if we integrate humanitarian approaches into human rights law, because then we make it a language that is spoken at a court, and a court can make something, can decide cases, and can bring about direct consequences for people suffering. And last but not least, something that is now my European perspective. As I said, I was working for the European Court of Human Rights. We have 47 states. We have about, I think, 193 states. And what is interesting, 47 states have ratified this European Convention on Human Rights, whereas all states of the world have ratified the most basic conventions of humanitarian law. So we represent only 1/4 of mankind, whereas the others, that is really one of the few approaches in international law that is global or universal. And now let me just explain how we are struggling with these two different regimes on two cases. One is Hassan versus United Kingdom. The other is an interstate complaint about the war, Georgia versus Russia. Hassan was a case about a young man. He was the brother of a military commander in the Iraq War. He was found by the American troops standing on the roof of his brother's house and having a rifle in his hand. And so the American soldiers and the British soldiers together, they brought him to a camp of prisoners of war. And later on, he was released as he was not found to be interesting for the British and the American. And then he was released, but he never arrived home. But he was found dead far away, obviously tortured. That was the case which was brought to the European Court of Human Rights. And the question I want to center on was if the American and the British soldiers could in the first place arrest him and take him with them. According to humanitarian law, yes, because it was unclear his status, he could be taken. According to human rights law, no, because there was no such exception and liberty is understood to be restricted only very narrowly. So the question for us as a court was, what do we apply? The regime of humanitarian law? Then we would have to find a violation. And compensation would have to be paid, so direct consequences, or we apply humanitarian law and say, well, that is allowed under humanitarian law. And there we try to interpret both in one and to interpret human rights law in the light of humanitarian law. So there I'm probably with this harmonizing approach of Julia. Now, the second case is Georgia versus Russia. You know, there was the 5 days war. And during this war, there was a hot conflict when shelling and shooting was omnipresent. The victims of this war brought the case, or the state of Georgia brought the case to the European Court of Human Rights. And the question was now if the European Court of Human Rights had jurisdiction and could apply human rights law during this hot period of the conflict. The Human Rights Court answered no, it could not, because that was beyond what its task was. It had been extending its jurisdictions further and further, but it said no, that is the point where we have to stop. And what I find interesting for our discussion is that the court somehow said, well, perhaps first I quote what it said. The court reiterates in this connection that this does not mean, so that it cannot adjudicate the case, does not mean that states can act outside any legal framework. As indicated above, they are obliged to comply with the very detailed rules of international humanitarian law in such a context. So what the court says, I can't help you. You are victims of a conflict. That is a problem of humanitarian law. So what you have, no judgment, no compensation paid, nobody found guilty. We leave you alone, but you have still humanitarian law where there is no court, no possibility to enforce, no compensation paid. And that is why there was an outcry in the human rights community to say, well, that is a completely wrong judgment. You cannot leave them only based on humanitarian law. So you see, I have a very different approach, a practice approach, where I always have to see, I have two regimes. I have to apply one, the convention as the European Convention on Human Rights, and I can apply it together or I leave out the other regime. But I admit that my concept of humanitarian law is very different of your very broad concept of humanitarianism, which is behind. That is just sort of a part of it that I can say, that I can see. And so perhaps just one last remark. also now from my perspective and a direct response to your dichotomy, Michael, when you look, for example, at the relation individual state in those two approaches, then you say, well, humanitarian approach has to be pragmatic. You have to get access to those inside. You don't want to change the state. You accept it as you want to help. On the other hand, you say human rights approach, you are critical to the state, you want to change. But still, let me just end on this point, human rights lawyers have to be very pragmatic as well, because we cannot act against states. We can enforce human rights only together with states if we understand them as part of international law, because international law cannot be enacted against the will of a state. So as a rule, we need the states as treaty, those who conclude the treaties. We cannot do anything in Belarus because they have not concluded the treaty. So we also have to have a sort of pragmatic approach to states, and the human rights legal system is also financed by states. So there is also, I would want to stress that there I see also quite a pragmatic approach in order to enforce human rights, and perhaps also to change states. You first have to cooperate with them, otherwise it won't function. That's just some scattered ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelika. I'm happy that after rejecting the term humanitarianism, you did not stop, but you showed us that there are two legal regimes operating, and actually bringing in the question of norms and of different legal regimes. And if I'm correct, I saw some kind of harmonizing tendency in both comments when Julia was talking and asking directly to Michael, is there really a world of difference, question mark? And also you said, well, there is also this harmonizing tendency between two legal regimes and how they operate. So before, and I see there are a couple of questions coming in already, before opening it to the audience, Michael, I would like to give you the chance to react directly to, briefly to both comments.
Yeah, those are great comments, and I really appreciate them. I'll try to be brief. The one thing I have to say though, it's awful writing things because they can be used against you. And Julia did that. It was sort of, and true confession here. So when I was writing the book, and I had to find something to say, this is, humanitarianism is different from human rights. And I needed something to, and this is actually it's an epistemic move for trying to establish something called humanitarianism. Because remember, I said all my friends are human rights people, and they didn't understand that there was a difference. And so I had to, in many ways, come up with something that said, this is what my book is about. Don't come looking to this book for conversations about human rights. I'm not doing that. And so I had to create a very strong fixed wall, which, as someone who deeply believes in social construction, just knew this completely violated every single first principle I held. But nevertheless, pragmatically, it seemed to be the way to go. But I have to say, I was never happy with that for precisely that contradiction. So you're right. I think the questions of chronology and periodization, I think, makes sense. I actually do think that there have been, if you will, defining trends in terms of discourse and use in practice. Between them, I think in many ways, my take on this is that much of the changes that, in terms of how we understand human rights, or even the move from human rights to international human rights, was fairly distinct from what was going on in humanitarianism. And what was going on in terms of the evolution of humanitarianism was fairly distinct from a lot was going on in human rights. There are exceptions like the Geneva Conventions, post-World War II. But by and large, it really wasn't until after, the end of the Cold War that you began to see these things really come into attention. And if you will, this is when each had an awareness of the other, and each took the other into account as it was doing things. And so that it opened up, in my view, and I think we're in agreement, Julia, a whole new chapter of things. There are a couple of issues, though, that I think, that haven't been talked about, that I think worth talking about. And I don't have answers. I'm just sort of, so Angelika spends a lot of time on law. And what I think is interesting is that, except for, as you know, international humanitarian law and refugee law, much of humanitarianism is not legalized. This is more about moral codes, whereas human rights, if it's not a law, it doesn't exist. And I think that's interesting. And there have been very moments, as I understand it, where some aspects of humanitarianism have, if you will, been invited to be legalized. And humanitarians have said, we prefer not to go that way. That there was some hesitation about what would be the impact of turning essentially our moral ethics into law, and what would be the and would it be over time that the law bears no relationship to our moral ethics. Another thing too that I'm interested in as well, beyond, in addition to legalization, is professionalization. And what professionalization, because these are both two bodies, two regimes that have, in terms of the world of practice, that have become professionalized. And I think it means different things, and as they move to different professions, and they orient themselves around different kinds of communities of practice. And so when we say, how do we distinguish the two? I think in many ways it's, and I think we may be in agreement here. It's looking at those communities of practice, how they develop, what norms they're diffusing, what kinds of cultural orientations they exist. And part of the reason why is because this is what is the foundation of our pragmatics. What is practical in, let's say, human rights would be different than what's seen as practical in humanitarianism. So I take your point very seriously that there's a pragmatic element, of course, in human rights, but I think but it's pragmatic in terms of what's the bigger goal, as you're thinking about steps towards something else. And I think that's consequential. The last thing I want to do, though, is push back again on this issue of convergence or harmonization between the two. I don't know. Maybe I just see, as a political scientist, I can't see the world in anything but conflict terms. Everything's an oppositional, everything's about power, and everything's about authority, and some people have it and other people don't. But let me just sort of, two examples for is that in Myanmar, back in one of the typhoons, this is when the junta was still in power. Now they're back. But, there was that huge debate about how is there going to get access. And there were a lot of humanitarians that wanted access. And the concern was that the humanitarians who were beginning to deliver aid would be the first foot soldiers for an attempt to overthrow the junta. Because, of course, this is in a context in which there was tremendous human rights pressure, rightly, on Yangon to actually think about a democratic transition. And one of the things that had to take place was, a deep conversation, and then finding other parties that could provide that assistance, in part because there was so much suspicion from the capital about what these outside actors were ultimately about. Were they basically human rights activists in humanitarian clothing? The other one, and again, this is, conversations I've had with humanitarian workers in the field who've been dealing with gender-based violence, is that when women are brought into health clinics, and the instinct for health practitioners is to do whatever they can to deal with the immediate physical and emotional trauma that has occurred to victims of sexual violence. They have noted, though, on various occasions, they have a difficult time working with human rights professionals, because what they want is they want access to the victims as soon as they can, because that's when memories are freshest, because that's when depositions can be taken, but that's when reports can be delivered. And so there have been various kinds of tensions on the ground then about when human rights activists want access, they want stories, right? They need records. And what many health practitioners have told me, though, is that can often lead to the re-traumatization of the victims. But for human rights activists who want to put together case reports, it's absolutely essential for building that case that you can then take into a court of law. And these are, I think, we talk about practices, which I think is that's what the conclusion in the book is about, is exactly where you want to go. I think these practices are different often, not always, but often, because of their different objectives. And I think that has to be, it's not to say that needs to be taken seriously and therefore must trump any question about where they can harmonize, because clearly there are places where they have harmonized. But I've always been interested in these debates that go on between different fields of practice where there are often considerable tensions, and how they get worked out and to whose advantage.
Michael, yeah, okay, so this final point, because there are a couple of questions and we have 20 minutes left, so I would like to bring in some questions from the audience. One question, we're talking about refugee law and the relation to humanitarianism. Anna Gardiau has asked a question: how would you encompass UNHCR humanitarian work and advance on refugee rights during the 1960s within this framework? So it's also a question on the question of thesaurus and the relation between refugee law and humanitarianism. It's probably an historical question, so Julia, would you like to answer, because it's not directed to anyone special?
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think this is actually one of the points, one of the places where a lot of scholarship recently has been pointing to the convergence. The literature I'm most familiar with right now, there's been several books coming out on the refugee crises following the Vietnam War, as well as the civil wars in Central America during the 1980s. And we see a lot of the rhetoric of rights and humanitarianism kind of intersecting in these points of conflict, but also the refugee crises that follow these points of conflict. So no, and I think that when we look at questions of refugees and thinking about the distinctions, right, that we're trying to draw here about relieving suffering on the one hand, but also protecting the rights in terms of violence, in terms of sexual violence, all of these things are intersecting. And I think that we can possibly look at both humanitarianism and human rights as separate, sort of distinct categories, but that coexist at the same time, right? So we might, in fact, be talking about humanitarianism and human rights at once. And I think that in questions of refugee crises, we certainly see this. So, yeah.
Okay. Michael, it's coming back to the question of thesaurus. I mean,
Just make a quick two-finger then on Julia, because I agree. I think one of the interesting things, though, in terms of the history of the relationship between rights and refugees, which, as you know, the first language of rights begins after World War I, and then becomes codified and expanded after World War II, including, most importantly, right, the crown jewel of refugee law, non-refoulement. I think the overall sentiment, given that, part of the difficulty, of course, I mean, awful situation for refugees is that you can no longer look to your state for protection. You know, you can no longer avail yourself to protection. And so yes, the relationship between refugees and rights are very intimate. And part of it is that language of rights has been one of the few forms of protection that are available to refugees because of their status as being in limbo. And so I think they're the language of rights. Granted, there's really nowhere else to go except for the language of rights in many ways for protection, although obviously UNHCR and now IOM and lots of other humanitarian organizations will find other ways for protection than just simply rights.
Michael, there's a direct, Angelika, please.
Just because I found that so very interesting what Michael said already during his talk, the idea of progress. Would you say what you just said, that fixing the rights of refugees or speaking the language of rights concerning refugees, that this is a sign of progress?
Oh, do I have to go there? So I would say, okay, so the answer is, I would say, one way to say progress is that this represents an advance. I think one of the things that we've seen, though, is that those kinds of rights as progress are very much dependent on the underlying sort of geopolitics of the moment. And so what we now have, of course, is, and I see this every day in the United States with respect to the southern border, certainly as Julia does as well, where rights are being trampled on constantly. And rights did not help the Haitians who were being shuttled from the southern border back to Haiti. And so, there's always that question of compliance. But I think one of the dangers of the world we live in now is that we have lots of rights that on paper look like progress, but in practice, nothing's changed really in many ways.
Michael, there is one question directed to you. It's from Avid George, and the question is, how useful and fruitful is it analytically to see humanitarianism as not political? Or says this probably more about how or some or many humanitarian activists want to be seen or see themselves? This is a question about humanitarianism apolitical, human rights political.
Yeah, no, with the humanitarianism, this is a bit of a confidence trick in that you want to present, I'm going to try to convince you that I'm apolitical. And this is how I'm going to do it. And the reason why I want to convince you that I'm apolitical is not because I'm really apolitical, because, I've got sympathies, I feel solidarities, but rather I need you to treat me or see me as apolitical so I can do my work and get access to populations on the ground. So, obviously, for me, when I meet with humanitarian workers, they're deeply political. They have an idea of what they'd like to see. Their sympathies go with certain populations and not others. But when it comes to the way they work and the presentation of self, they need to try to convince others that they're apolitical. And to the extent that they're successful, they can do their work. So this is more about, a house of mirrors of sorts. It's a bit of trickery.
Okay. It's probably also, there could be also said more about the use of different legal regimes, as Angelika said in her brief comment. How political actors are using the different legal regimes. However, we have a question which is actually related to our recent situation, to COVID. And the question is by Damilola. And her question is, could you please elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between COVID and the deteriorating of humanitarianism in Africa? And maybe I would also add to the three of you, could you also, from your perspective, what will be the relationship between, how does COVID influence our relationship or the relationship between human rights and humanitarianism? I remember that at the end of, I think you did not mention it in the talk, but in your book, you mentioned the huge impact of COVID on this relationship as a question mark for the future. So this would be interesting. Maybe Julia, you could start, and then we move to Angelika and Michael.
No, and I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot too is what we might, we're talking about humanitarianism and human rights, but adding in a third sort of pillar here, which is development and sustainable development. And thinking about kind of, when we're talking about humanitarianism, we often are thinking of it as a reactive response to current suffering. If we tie in kind of questions of development, but also prevention, mitigation, access to healthcare, the development of health infrastructures, I think we can see a lot of these sorts of issues playing out. But it also raises questions, do we have a right to healthcare, right? Is there a universal right to healthcare? Is there an essential right to healthcare? A lot of my fellow compatriots would probably say no in the United States. But, I think if we think about, is there a right to access healthcare, and then how does that relate to questions of suffering and preventing suffering through development? I think we can kind of see some of those questions coming out with the current COVID pandemic. The other thing I would point to, though, too, is that I think that the questioner mentioned sort of the situation in Africa specifically. For all the attention that COVID has rightfully been getting, we've been ignoring completely the diarrheal diseases that kill millions and millions of children every year. Tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, malaria, AIDS, the numbers there have dropped off dramatically in terms of prevention and care, with the focus on COVID, with the sort of the problems with the health infrastructure because of it. So I think we also have to think about these kind of constellation of related health issues that arises in times of pandemics as we think about these questions too.
Angelika, do you see an impact of COVID-19 to legal norms already in the field of humanitarian legal regime and human rights legal regime or human rights law?
Yeah, I think it's quite a good example to show how it functions, because based on human rights approach, you would say right to life. You have a right to life. You have an obligation of the state to save your right to life, to uphold it. And in the COVID situation, we came to a point where we saw that perhaps the state will not be able, if we have too many infected people and we have not enough beds in the hospitals, the state just cannot live up to its duty to fulfill its what we call positive obligation to save lives. And then actually what enters into is this very painful discussion about what we call triage, about who will then get help, the most needy ones, those who have the best chance to survive for a longer time, the youngest ones, whatever. And you know that in Germany, I guess in the United States as well, we had a very, very difficult, or we still have a very difficult ethical debate about all those questions. And there actually human rights law doesn't help you anymore, because you just say you have a duty, but you don't fulfill the duty. And then perhaps there comes in some humanitarian aspects of helping in the first place and without being legalized. But there is really an open field where we see also the limits of what we can achieve based on human rights.
Michael, how is your what is your impression, or what is your perspective on the impact of COVID-19?
Well, I've tried to look at COVID-19 through a humanitarian lens, and the first thing is that this is a humanitarian crisis. I mean, we're talking about obviously millions and millions of people who have who've been affected, who've died. And this is a humanitarian crisis. This is about urgency. This is about lives at risk. The second thing is, as Angelika pointed out, is that there's also another language that's very prominent within humanitarianism, which is triage. which is trying to figure out basically what triage is about is who lives and who dies. And the ideal from a public health perspective is that we can make judgments. There's different theories of triage, but we can make rational allocation decisions that based on our ethical principles. The problem, of course, is that there's not a triage committee at the global level making these decisions. These are decisions that are made not just by states, but the other is by pharmaceutical companies. And so, again, that's another layer that shapes what can be done in terms of humanitarianism. I think there's, in many ways at a global humanitarian level, what we're dealing with is, as my public health friends like to say, it's just this huge trolley game, that old philosophical scenario about you pull the trolley and it goes one way, kills 3 people, it goes another way and kills 2. And what do? I think it's humanitarianism doesn't really provide much of an answer. I will say one thing that is interesting in terms of how this may shake out for humanitarianism, which is that one of the ongoing debates in humanitarian sector is something called localization, that action should not be directed, thousands of miles away from Geneva, but rather it should be done by those who are affected by these dynamics, those who are on the local. One of the things that's happened with COVID is that a lot of aid agencies have had to remove themselves for fear, not so much of getting COVID, but rather of giving COVID to local populations. And that has actually prioritized then local capacity building, to use that term. And returns then to, I think Julia's, spot on point then, that what needs to happen if there's any hope is that there is a development of public health infrastructure, which has been neglected for decades. And so, and that's something that humanitarians have not done a very good job in. And I don't know if human rights has something to offer there, but it's certainly one of those issues that, that must be addressed going forward.
I do have a good news and bad news. The good news is that we have lots of questions coming in. The bad news is that we only have 5 minutes to go. But I don't want to end with a bad news. The good news is that we have a conference next year. So I'm sorry that we can't answer all the questions. They are related to development, to the instrumentalization of human rights language. So I would like to ask the audience or the people who ask question, raise question, keep the question, register for next year's conference, and then hopefully we'll meet all in Hanover and then we discuss it. Because I would like to give, at the end of this very stimulating discussion, I would like to give the 3 panelists, each of you, the chance, like, let's say 2 sentences, a kind of final statement about your prospect. What do you expect about the future relationship between human rights and humanitarianism? Will they remain distant cousins, as Michael mentioned? Will they become closer or even more distant? So, yeah, brief, two sentences, 3 sentences. And I would like to start, ladies first, with Angelika.
Well, I just can take up Michael's question, who will win, humanitarianism or human rights? And he said humanitarianism because otherwise the liberal world is not strong enough, and human rights are more connected to the liberal world. I just want, in 1 sentence, I just want to put a question mark there. I'm not sure if he's right, and I think we should discuss that in Hanover.
Well, very good. So, Julia, what is your prospect?
Two trends, 2 sentences. No, building on something I just said, I think we will see more attention to sustainable development and its relationship to both humanitarianism and human rights. If you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of what we've been talking about just now, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, zero hunger, zero poverty, all of these are both development questions and humanitarian questions and rights questions. So I hope we can kind of talk about that. And then the elephant in the room that I don't think we've talked much about is climate. Climate will indelibly, the climate crisis is going to shape questions of humanitarianism and human rights for the rest of our lives. And I think that is going to be something that is a really defining part of our
Yes, and natural disaster, as you are an expert of natural disaster and catastrophe, so absolutely. And it's actually also on the list of questions about climate change and the impact to humanitarian aid, but also on question on human rights. So Michael, what is your brief prospect? I mean, you gave already the answer, but I try it again.
Okay, I'll let's see if you like this answer better. Okay, I think both humanitarianism and human rights have a huge problem, which is, and I put it in colloquial terms, and that's the decline of humanity. I see this as something that is, in terms of any kind of discourse of humanity, it's in trouble. It's in trouble for lots of reasons. And I think we've seen the sense in which we are moving backwards in terms of feelings of obligations to distant others, caring about the circumstances of vulnerable populations, whether it's about needs or rights. Both, I think both are in trouble. I don't know what to recommend for human rights. I think that's happening. I'd be curious to know. I'll have to wait till Hanover to find out what that means for a human rights strategy. If I was the president of the humanitarian sector, I would probably say, try to divorce yourself as much as possible from forms of liberalism as you can. Find another way to anchor humanitarianism and what will be seen as more clearly bottom-up universal values of helping others in severe distress. But I think we're, quite honest, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And, rather than saying, I don't want to suggest that it's, humanitarianism. This is not a gladiatorial cage fight, humanitarianism versus human rights, and who's going to come out ahead with the, at this moment of the end of the liberal international order. Both need to survive. And it'd be great, talk about sort of not just convergence, but strategizing about what that would mean for both as they can help each other going forward in a very, very dark world.
So many topics to discuss next year in Hanover, but before we are moving to Hanover, or we can come to Hanover, hopefully, there's another pre-panel. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Julia, Angelika, Michael, very much for stimulating, for your comments, for your keynote, for the discussion, but also the audience for all the questions coming in. And please accept my apology that we could not answer all. Keep the question and we will hopefully answer them or discuss them in Hanover. But before saying goodbye, I would like to point to tomorrow's panel entitled Forced Displacement, Unlawful Internment and Humanitarian Neutrality by former UN Secretary General Adama Dieng. Great to have him for the panel tomorrow. The panel will be chaired by Andrew Thompson, and it will start also tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 p.m. You will find the link on the webpage of Volkswagen Foundation. So hope to see you all tomorrow. I'm sure that will be also a very stimulating discussion. And it's just for me to say, have a lovely rest of your day, which is longer in the United States, shorter here in Germany, but have a lovely rest of the day and hopefully see you tomorrow. Goodbye from Cologne.
Thank you, Julia and Angela and Angelika and Fabian for organizing this. This is fun.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.